In 1865, kerosene cost 58 cents per gallon. Within 2 decades, one man dropped it to 8 cents. Sounds like a hero story, right? America's greatest philanthropist bringing light to the masses? Wrong. What you're about to discover is how John D. Rockefeller turned efficiency into the most devastating competitive weapon in American history. How he used the promise of lower prices as a Trojan horse to eliminate 90% of his competition. And how he built a system so perfect, so ruthlessly optimized, that it became the blueprint for corporate dominance that still shapes your life today. By the end of this video, you'll never look at a great deal the same way again. Picture this: thousands of independent refiners, wildcat drillers striking oil one day, bankrupt the next, prices swinging from pennies to dollars overnight. It's the Wild West of commerce, and everyone shooting in every direction. The first commercial oil well had been drilled just 11 years earlier in Titusville, Pennsylvania. Since then, the industry had exploded into absolute madness. Anyone with a few $1,000s could build a refinery. The barriers to entry were low, the potential profits were astronomical, and the result was predictable chaos. Refineries were literally exploding. The technology was primitive, dangerous, and wildly inconsistent. One batch of kerosene would burn clean and bright. The next would smoke, smell, or worse, explode in someone's lamp and burn down their house. There were no standards, no regulations, no quality control.
And the waste. Oh, the waste. Refiners would extract kerosene and dump everything else into rivers, creating environmental disasters that made entire towns uninhabitable. They were literally pouring potential profits into streams because they didn't know any better. Enter John D. Rockefeller, 31 years old, a bookkeeper's son with a radical idea that will change capitalism forever. But here's what your history textbook didn't tell you. Rockefeller didn't just want to succeed in this market, he wanted to eliminate the market itself. In his own words, Rockefeller believed competition was a sin, not inefficient, not wasteful, a sin. He looked at the chaos of the free market and saw something fundamentally broken, something that needed to be replaced with what he called cooperation. But cooperation was just the polite word. The real word was monopoly. Rockefeller had started in 1863 with a single refinery in partnership with Maurice Clark. Within 2 years, he bought out Clark for $72,500 in what he would later call the most important day of my life. He was now in complete control, and control was what Rockefeller valued above all else. Now, Rockefeller had a problem. He controlled about 10% of America's oil refining capacity. There were hundreds of competitors, many just as capable, just as ambitious. He needed an edge. So he found one, and it wasn't where you'd expect. Most people think Rockefeller won because he was ruthless. That's only half true. The other half, he was obsessed with efficiency to a degree that bordered on madness. Let me show you what I mean. While his competitors were running refineries that processed crude oil into kerosene and threw away everything else, Rockefeller saw waste, and waste was unacceptable. His refineries didn't just make kerosene, they captured every single byproduct. The petroleum jelly became Vaseline. The gasoline, then considered useless and often burned off as waste, was sold as solvent and cleaning fluid. The paraffin wax went to candle makers. The sulfuric acid waste sold to fertilizer companies. Even the naphtha that other refiners vented into the air was captured and sold. The barrels themselves became legendary examples of his obsession. Rockefeller employed coopers who manufactured barrels in-house from lumber he owned. His engineers calculated that exactly 17 staves per barrel was optimal, not 16, which was too weak and would leak, not 18, which wasted wood, 17. And they measured the iron hoops to ensure they used the minimum amount of metal necessary to maintain integrity. But it went deeper than that. Rockefeller counted the drops of solder used to seal each barrel. When he discovered workers were using 40 drops, he asked them to try 38. Some barrels leaked, so they settled on 39 drops. Across thousands of barrels, this microscopic optimization saved thousands of dollars. He employed chemists when his competitors relied on intuition and tradition. These chemists developed proprietary processes that increased kerosene yields and improved quality. A Rockefeller barrel of kerosene burned cleaner and brighter than his competitor's product, which meant customers came back. His refineries pioneered continuous process systems when others still operated in batches. Raw crude oil entered one end of the facility and flowed through a series of precisely engineered stages: distillation, treatment, purification, storage. The product moved to the workers, not the other way around. This was revolutionary. Every single movement, every single cent, optimized. Rockefeller also understood something his competitors didn't: scale. The bigger his operation grew, the more efficient it became. He could negotiate better prices for crude oil by promising to buy in massive quantities. He could invest in better equipment because the cost could be spread across millions of gallons. He could hire specialists and experts because he had enough volume to justify their salaries. This is what economists now call economies of scale, but Rockefeller lived it before anyone had coined the term. The result? By the mid-1870s, Rockefeller could refine a gallon of kerosene for less than half a cent, while his competitors spent 2 or 3 cents. In an industry where margins were already razor thin, this was devastation. But here's where it gets interesting. He didn't just pocket the difference. That would be thinking too small. He weaponized it. Rockefeller realized something profound. The real money wasn't in refining alone. It was in controlling every single step from the ground to the customer's lamp. This is what business schools now call vertical integration, but Rockefeller didn't have a business school. He just had an instinct for the jugular. First, transportation. In the 1870s, getting oil from the wells in Pennsylvania to the refineries in Cleveland meant dealing with railroads, and railroads charged whatever they wanted, playing refiners against each other to maximize their own profits. The Pennsylvania Railroad, the Erie Railroad, and the New York Central were the titans of transportation. They could make or break any refinery based on the rates they charged. So Rockefeller made them an offer they couldn't refuse. He went to the railroad executives and said, "I can guarantee you regular, massive shipments, entire trainloads every single day, 52 weeks a year, no seasonal fluctuations, no uncertainty, but I need a discount."
The railroads agreed. They gave Rockefeller rates that were 50% lower than what his competitors paid. But that wasn't even the most outrageous part. Rockefeller demanded something called drawbacks. Here's how they worked. Every time a competitor shipped oil on these railroads, they paid full price, and then the railroad would take a portion of that payment and give it to Rockefeller as a kickback. Read that again. Every time a competitor shipped oil, they unknowingly paid Rockefeller for the privilege. His competitors were literally funding his competitive advantage. When word of this arrangement leaked, independent refiners were outraged. They called it theft, corruption, unfair competition. And they were right. But Rockefeller didn't care about fairness. He cared about efficiency and control. The railroad scheme was just the beginning of his vertical integration strategy. He started buying up pipelines. In the early days of oil, crude was transported from wells to refineries via railroad, or increasingly through pipelines. Whoever controlled the pipelines controlled access to the oil itself. Rockefeller's pipeline subsidiary, the National Transit Company, became the largest pipeline network in America.
If you were an independent refiner and wanted crude oil, you had to go through Rockefeller's pipelines and pay his fees. And if you were competing with him, well, your oil might experience unexpected delays in transit. But transportation was just one piece. Rockefeller bought timberland in Michigan and Pennsylvania to ensure a steady supply of wood for his barrels and crates. He purchased entire forests, employed lumberjacks, ran sawmills, and manufactured millions of barrels per year. He created his own cooperage works, his own wagon shops, his own warehousing facilities in every major city. He built tank cars specifically designed for oil transport, then leased them to railroads, ensuring that even when competitors shipped oil, they often did so in Rockefeller's equipment. By 1880, Standard Oil owned warehouses at every major distribution point in the United States: New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, St. Louis. If kerosene was being sold in America, it was probably stored in a Standard Oil warehouse at some point. He created his own sales force, eliminating wholesalers and their markups. Standard Oil representatives visited general stores, grocers, and lamp shops directly, cutting out middlemen and capturing those profits for the company. Imagine trying to compete with that. You're an independent refiner in 1880. You pay full price for transportation, while Rockefeller pays half and gets kickbacks from your shipments. You buy barrels at market rates. He makes them for pennies. You use wholesalers who take a cut. He sells direct. You need pipelines to get crude oil. He owns them. You're fighting a war where the enemy owns the supply lines, the weapons factories, the roads you march on, and the maps you need to navigate. You've already lost. You just don't know it yet. Now, vertical integration gave Rockefeller control over the supply chain. But he had another move that would make him legendary and eventually illegal: horizontal integration, buying out every competitor until there was no competition left. Here's where the 58 cents to 8 cents comes in, and here's where we see the predatory genius at work. Rockefeller developed a systematic approach to eliminating competition. It was methodical, ruthless, and devastatingly effective. In any given city, Rockefeller would identify the local refiners. He'd study their operations, understand their cost structures, identify their weaknesses. Then he'd deploy what became known as predatory pricing. Here's how it worked. If kerosene sold for 25 cents in a market, Rockefeller would suddenly drop his price to 10 cents or 8 cents, or however low he needed to go to make competition impossible. But here's the key. He only did this in markets where competitors existed. In markets where Standard Oil was already dominant, prices stayed high. This is crucial to understanding the strategy. His competitors would panic. They'd see their margins evaporate overnight. They'd try to match his prices and bleed money every single day. Their costs were higher, their operations were less efficient, they lacked his economies of scale. Within months, they'd be desperate, taking loans, missing payroll, facing bankruptcy. That's when Rockefeller's men would arrive with an offer. These weren't thugs or intimidators. They were well-dressed businessmen with briefcases full of carefully prepared analyses. They knew exactly how much debt you carried, exactly how long you could survive at current prices, exactly what your refinery was worth. Sell us your refinery. We'll pay fair value in cash or Standard Oil. Join Standard Oil, and you can keep running it as a manager with a guaranteed salary. You'll have job security, a steady income, and you won't have to worry about bankruptcy or your family's future. The offer was seductive, especially when you were bleeding money and couldn't see a way out. Some accepted gratefully, relieved to escape with something rather than lose everything. Many of these former competitors became wealthy from their Standard Oil stock and spent the rest of their careers working for the man who had crushed them. For those who refused, Rockefeller had other tools in his arsenal. He'd cut them off from transportation by using his leverage with railroads. He'd undercut their prices in every market simultaneously, something only a massive, vertically integrated company could afford to do. He'd outbid them for crude oil supplies, driving up their costs, while his own pipelines gave him preferential access. There's a famous story about a competitor in Buffalo who refused to sell. Standard Oil dropped prices in Buffalo to below cost and kept them there for 18 months. The competitor finally went bankrupt. Standard Oil bought his refinery at auction for pennies on the dollar, then immediately raised prices back to profitable levels. The message to other holdouts was clear. Resistance is expensive and futile.
One by one, they fell. Cleveland first, where Rockefeller systematically absorbed all 26 competing refiners in what became known as the Cleveland Massacre of 1872. Then Pittsburgh, where the story repeated. Then Philadelphia, New York, and the entire eastern seaboard. Between 1872 and 1879, Rockefeller absorbed over 80% of the refining capacity in the United States. By 1882, Standard Oil controlled 90% of America's oil refining and 95% of its pipelines. But controlling companies created legal complications. Each state had different laws. Managing hundreds of subsidiaries was administratively complex. So Rockefeller and his lawyers pioneered a new corporate structure, the trust. In 1882, the Standard Oil Trust was formed. All the various Standard Oil companies transferred their stock to a board of 9 trustees, with Rockefeller at the helm. This created a centralized monopoly that could coordinate operations across the entire country while technically remaining separate legal entities at the state level. It was legal genius. It was also the beginning of the end, because this structure made the monopoly visible and targetable. The sin of competition had been cleansed from the market, and Rockefeller ruled an empire unlike anything America had ever seen. Now here's where the story gets complicated, because Rockefeller wasn't lying about one thing. He did lower prices for consumers. That 58 cents per gallon in 1865, it really did drop to 8 cents by the mid-1880s. Even accounting for deflation, this represented a massive decrease in real costs. Kerosene became affordable for working-class families. Millions of Americans who had relied on expensive candles or simply gone to bed at sunset could now light their homes for pennies. Factory workers could read at night. Children could study after dark. Small businesses could extend their operating hours. By any measure, this was genuine progress. This was real value being created and passed on to consumers. Rockefeller's defenders, both then and now, point to this as proof that his methods were justified. Yes, he created a monopoly. Yes, he crushed competitors, but consumers benefited enormously. Isn't that what matters? But here's the question nobody asked. What did they give up in exchange? Choice, competition, the possibility of innovation from anyone except Rockefeller, the safety net of a diversified market. When Standard Oil controlled 90% of refining, they controlled what innovations reached the market. They decided which efficiency improvements to implement and which to suppress. If a competitor developed a better refining process, they either bought the company or undercut them until they failed. The gasoline engine was being developed in the 1880s and 1890s. Gasoline, remember, was a waste product that Rockefeller had figured out how to sell as a solvent. Did Standard Oil push for development of gasoline-powered vehicles? No. They focused on kerosene for lamps because that's where their profits were. What innovations were delayed or prevented because they didn't serve Standard Oil's interests? We'll never know because the market that might have developed them was eliminated.
And then there's the darker side that emerged once competition was eliminated. In markets where Standard Oil faced no competition, prices didn't stay at 8 cents. They rose, not back to 58 cents, but higher than the theoretical competitive equilibrium. The company could afford to sell at a loss in competitive markets because they more than made up for it in monopoly markets. Regional pricing became so extreme that in the 1890s, Standard Oil sometimes charged higher prices in the United States than in Europe, where they faced actual competition from Russian oil. American consumers, the very people whose lamps Rockefeller had supposedly illuminated, were subsidizing lower prices abroad. When communities complained about prices or service, where could they go? There was no alternative. Standard Oil was the only game in town. Independent gas station owners, the predecessors to modern distributors, had to accept whatever terms Standard Oil dictated. The company used exclusive dealing arrangements, meaning if you wanted to sell Standard Oil kerosene, you couldn't sell anyone else's products. Since Standard was often the only supplier available, this meant total dependence. Labor conditions in Standard Oil facilities became controversial. Workers had no leverage because the company was too powerful. When employees at one facility complained or organized, Rockefeller could simply shift production to another facility. The monopoly that brought efficiency to consumers brought powerlessness to workers. Rockefeller had created a system where efficiency replaced freedom, where low prices came with invisible chains. And here's the truly brilliant, terrifying part. Consumers loved it. They didn't see the monopoly forming. They just saw cheaper kerosene, higher quality products, and reliable supply. By the time they realized what had happened, it was too late to go back. The independent refiners were gone. Their equipment had been absorbed or scrapped. The expertise had been hired away or retired. The capital had moved on to other industries. You couldn't just restart competition. The infrastructure for competition had been systematically dismantled. This is the Rockefeller Paradox. He genuinely did create value for consumers through ruthless efficiency. But that value was the bait for a trap that would take the U.S. government decades to spring. Journalists and reformers began calling for action. Ida Tarbell, whose father had been ruined by Standard Oil, wrote a devastating exposé called The History of the Standard Oil Company that turned public opinion against the monopoly. States began passing antitrust laws. The federal government filed suit under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, a law that had been passed specifically because of concerns about trusts like Standard Oil. The case worked its way through the courts for years. Standard Oil fought back with armies, lawyers, and political influence. But in 1911, the Supreme Court finally ordered the breakup of Standard Oil under antitrust laws. The trust was divided into 34 separate companies, including what would become Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and others. It was supposed to restore competition, but by then, Rockefeller had already won. He owned stock in all the successor companies. When they were freed from the trust and allowed to compete, their stock prices soared. Rockefeller became even wealthier from the breakup than he had been from the monopoly. More importantly, he'd proven that extreme efficiency, combined with vertical and horizontal integration, could eliminate competition entirely. And he'd created a blueprint that every tech giant, retail behemoth, and corporate titan has studied ever since.
You might think this is ancient history, a story from the Gilded Age that regulations and antitrust laws have made irrelevant. You'd be wrong. Look at Amazon. They operate at razor-thin margins or even losses in many categories. They've built the most efficient logistics network in retail history. They control the marketplace, the delivery infrastructure, the cloud computing that powers their competitors' websites, and increasingly, the products themselves through Amazon Basics. Sound familiar? They use predatory pricing to eliminate competitors, then raise prices once they're gone. They leverage their control of the marketplace to advantage their own products. They've created a system where efficiency and low prices come with total dependency. Or consider the tech platforms. Google doesn't charge you for search, it's free, just like Rockefeller's kerosene was cheap. But you've given up privacy, market diversity, and the possibility of alternative information ecosystems. When one company controls 90% of search, they control what information exists and what doesn't. Facebook offers free connection with friends and family. The cost, your attention, your data, and a social infrastructure so dominant that alternatives can't gain traction. When everyone you know is on one platform, choosing a competitor isn't just inconvenient, it's isolating. These companies studied Rockefeller. They learned his lessons. Vertical integration? Check. Horizontal integration through acquisition? Check. Efficiency as a competitive weapon? Check. Predatory pricing? They call it platform subsidization now, but it's the same strategy. The difference is that today's monopolies are harder to see because the product is often free or seems free. You're not paying 8 cents for kerosene, you're paying nothing for search, but you're still paying, just in different currency. And just like in Rockefeller's time, by the time we notice the chains, the alternatives have already been eliminated. The independent bookstores that might have competed with Amazon, mostly gone. The search engines that might have challenged Google, absorbed or starved of users. The social networks that might have offered alternatives to Facebook, dead or marginalized. We're living in Rockefeller's world. We just call it by different names. Disruption instead of predatory pricing. Ecosystem instead of vertical integration. Network effects instead of monopoly. But the fundamental dynamic is the same. Efficiency is weaponized to eliminate competition. Short-term consumer value is used to justify long-term market concentration, and by the time we realize what we've traded, it's too late to get it back. So the next time you see prices dropping, when a company offers you incredible value, when efficiency seems to benefit everyone, ask yourself these questions. What am I trading for this convenience? Who is being eliminated while I enjoy these savings? What market am I helping to destroy with my rational, self-interested choices? Because Rockefeller taught us something profound and disturbing about capitalism. The greatest competitive weapon isn't quality or innovation or even customer service. It's the ability to make competition itself impossible. To make your offer so good, so efficient, so perfectly optimized that choosing anyone else seems irrational. And once everyone makes that rational choice, once the competitors are gone and the alternative systems have collapsed, what happens when the generous monopolist decides generosity no longer serves their interests? Rockefeller dropped kerosene from 58 cents to 8 cents. Then, in markets where he faced no competition, he raised it to 12 cents, 15 cents, whatever the market would bear. The efficiency gains didn't go away, but they stopped being passed on to consumers once there was no competitive pressure to do so. The pattern repeats because it works, because humans are rational, because we respond to incentives, because we choose immediate value over abstract concerns about market structure. Rockefeller's Standard Oil is gone, broken up a century ago, but his philosophy lives on, more powerful than ever, in platform monopolies, in vertical integration strategies, in predatory pricing masked as customer value, in efficiency worship that treats competition as wasteful rather than essential. The price of efficiency, it turns out, is rarely paid in dollars. It's paid in choices we didn't realize we were giving up, in alternatives that never got the chance to exist, in market dynamics that we only miss once they're gone.
John D. Rockefeller died in 1937, the richest man in modern history. His wealth in today's dollars would exceed $400 billion. But his real legacy isn't the money, it's the playbook. And that playbook is still being used every single day in industries and markets all around you. The question isn't whether we're still paying the price of efficiency. The question is, do we even notice anymore?